Welcome, everybody. We're absolutely delighted with the fantastic response to the talk today. My name is Nicola Jennings. I'm the director of the Athena Art Foundation, and we're absolutely delighted tonight to welcome as our guest speaker Caroline Campbell, Dr. Caroline Campbell. I'm going to introduce her properly in a few minutes, but I just want to say that I've known Caroline for quite a long time, and I know that she is a brilliant scholar and curator and is now a very inspiring museum director. And we're collaborating on this with the National Gallery of Ireland, who've been absolutely fantastic. So let me introduce Caroline. Dr. Caroline Campbell, Director of the National Gallery of Ireland, is one of the lead curators, along with Professor Joanna Cannon, of the wonderful Siena exhibition, which recently closed at the National Gallery in London, and before that at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. In fact, Caroline and Joanna Cannon initiated the project some 15 years ago. Caroline was born and educated in Belfast and became the director at the National Gallery of Ireland in November 22. She studied modern history at University College Oxford and has an MA and PhD from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. She's a former fellow of the Centre for Curatorial Leadership in New York. Before joining the National Gallery of Ireland, Caroline was Director of Collections and Research at the National Gallery in London. In her earlier career, she's held curatorial positions at the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, the Courtauld Gallery in London, and at the National Gallery in London. Caroline has published widely on European art from the Middle Ages to the 20th century, particularly on the Italian Renaissance. She has co-curated and curated many exhibitions, including the wonderful Bellini in the East, Love and Marriage in Renaissance Florence, Building the Picture Architecture in Italian Renaissance Drawing, Duccio Caro in Dialogue, and Mantegna and Bellini. Caroline is a strong advocate of widening participation and digital engagement in museums, and she's a member of Athena's advisory group, I'm delighted to say. Her interest in art history developed after a visit to the National Gallery in Ireland as a teenager, and she wants all young people to be able to see and enjoy great art. So, Caroline, welcome.
Thank you very much, Nicola. It's a real honor to be here this evening and talking with you and to be with so many other people on the call. Nicola, we've known each other for a long time as colleagues and as fellow scholars, and I really admire what you are doing with Athena. So it's great to be here for a conversation this evening. And as a medievalist, I think we can have an awful lot to talk about this evening, because you come to this with your perspective of working on the arts of Spain and other places, and your keen interrogation and eye for detail. So I think we will have a great dialogue in the next 35 minutes or so.
Well, Caroline, let's start. Can I ask you to give us a brief introduction to the exhibition?
Sure. So this is an installation shot of one of the rooms of the exhibition in London. You can see the great altarpiece by Pietro Lorenzetti, made for Bishop Tarlati of Arezzo in around about 1319. And I suppose the idea for the exhibition was Sienese painting of the 14th century is really important for the art historical narrative, but it's often been completely underplayed in comparison to its near neighbour, sometimes rival, sometimes enemy, the city of Florence. And that's really because art history as we know it was essentially written by somebody who was writing for the Florentine state, and that's Giorgio Vasari, the great artist from Arezzo, where indeed this altarpiece was made, and where it went back yesterday onto the high altar of the Church of the Pieve, as I know from a photograph I was sent yesterday evening. But Vasari worked for the Medici Grand Dukes, and he writes his Lives of the Artists, which is one of the most influential art histories ever written. And essentially that's written from a Florentine perspective. And at the time that Vasari is writing, in the 1560s and 1550s, Florence has just conquered Siena. Siena has stopped being an independent state. And it's really, really interesting the impact that that has on awareness, dissemination of Sienese art. And this
Hmm.
exhibition was intended to look at that again, and also not to look at Sienese art of the 14th century as being proto-Renaissance, but as being something on its own terms.
The thing that really struck me, and also reading the catalogue, is the emphasis on Sienese narrative skills, material splendor, and innovation. And shall we start talking about some of the actual paintings? And maybe as we go through, you can tell me about specific issues, such as, for example, how important the veneration of the Virgin Mary
Mm,
was in
mm.
terms of, the iconography and, and some of the key works that you think we should pick up.
Absolutely. And something else I should say is that organizing, curating, doing an exhibition is a very, very different enterprise to writing an art historical book. And things that might work in the context of a book are not going to work on the context of a wall. And often that's to do with really simple things such as scale, and also things that look good or don't look good together. So this was an exhibition that was conceived as an exhibition, as something that would have a would be visual, would be inviting, would be exciting, but would also address questions of scholarship, such as relationship between objects, and something that is very important to me as a scholar of material of the 14th and 15th centuries is to think about the question of innovation. It's very, very easy when looking back at the past of 600 or 700 years ago, to look at this as art that is old. Of course, it is old, but it is also art that in its own time was extraordinarily innovative and new. And that sense of novelty is something which is difficult to convey in objects which to a 21st century reader just do look like old things. And that's partly because of their age and also because of the fact there's a lot of gold involved. And also there are an awful lot of Christian devotional subject matters. So the exhibition, we wanted it to seem true to its time, and part of that is about not making this as a story of tradition, but as a story of innovation and change. And essentially, in the exhibition, we concentrated on four painters, and that's Duccio, the Lorenzetti brothers, Pietro and Ambrogio, and Simone Martini. And it's also an exhibition which was created through its core was looking what was possible to do from the collections of the National Gallery and the Met. Exhibitions are the art of the possible. They are what it is possible to borrow, what it is possible to install, and yet they have to seem like a coherent visual experience from that. But the nucleus of these two great collections gave us an opportunity, which was really, I think, unparalleled in what we could think about bringing together. So the core was the two collections, and one extraordinary object which we were able to show in London, which has never left the Met since it was acquired. It's one of the key objects in that collection, even though it's minuscule. It's about the size, it's about the height of the computer screens we're probably all looking at for this call. It shows wonderful Madonna and Child, the Stockley Madonna, painted in the probably around 1290. A painting which I think you can see is remarkable for the connection between mother and child. This wonderful gesture of the child's hand reaching up to his mother's veil, something that's very typical of small children, but also the tenderness I love in which his toes are touching her wrist. This has been thought about so carefully, and one of the ways it's been thought about is to make clear that this is an image. This is a visual representation, and that is so obvious from the parapet which appears in the bottom of this little painting. This is one of the most radical aspects about it, that this is not an icon, this is an image.
Yeah. Amazing. I mean, I've always thought that Van Eyck was one of the earliest to put these parapets in, but actually, you look at this and it's there. So
Yeah, no.
it's amazingly early. Yeah.
It is really
Yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah.
And Duccio is such an incredible painter because of his technical prowess, his respect for the tradition of image making with which he grows up and is all around him in Siena. I should say, though I'm sure everyone on this call knows it, that Siena in the late 13th and early 14th centuries is one of the most commercially important and successful cities in Europe. It's also the center of one of the major pilgrimage routes from Northern Europe to Rome. The Via Francigena goes through Siena. It is renowned for its trade in fine objects, in metalwork, but particularly for its dominance of the currency markets and of trade. And also at the moment in which these artists are working, it's a city state which is it's not democratic in our modern sense at all, but it is more representative in terms of its government than many others in Europe. And that's important for art commissioning because many of the people who are commissioning art, whether for private or for public contexts, are also involved through this period in government for a while. If you think of the beautiful city of Siena itself and the Palazzo Pubblico centered on the Campo or square at the center, where one palio has just been run and another will be run in a couple of weeks' time, that's a tradition, of course, which has been going since the 14th century. And Siena has a remarkable tradition of public government, which really started at the time that we're looking at in this exhibition.
Yes. I mean, I think coming back to the question of you not being able to include obviously frescoes, that are
Yeah,
in situ. And obviously one thinks of the Ambrogio Lorenzetti, the good and bad
the good and
government,
bad
which
government indeed.
which which I don't know if all the listeners know it, but if not, I urge you to look it up because it's one of the most extraordinary works of art I think ever produced. But that was clearly that spoke to what you've just been talking about. But I also wanted to say that I thought you did amazingly to not make us think, oh, I wish that was here, I wish that was here, because actually the way that you reconstructed the Maesta, for example, and we'll come on to that, Dutra's Maesta, was fantastic and gave us a selection of the panels. So I think really congratulations. We didn't feel, gosh, things are missing. We really wanted to know more about the things that were there. Um, but that
Well,
was what you've been talking about now, about all the conditions that made it such a great, rich environment for production was one of the questions I was going to ask you. Um, and then, of course, there was this question of the veneration of the Virgin, particularly in the
mm.
city, wasn't there, as well?
Indeed, there was. And should we move on to another image? What do you
Sure,
think?
absolutely.
Although I
You
could
tell
look at the
me.
Stockley Madonna
No,
forever.
no. Well,
Yes, here
yeah.
is
Don't go
another
to this one.
Virgin and Child by Duccio. This is the Virgin enthroned with angels from Bern, which is a tiny painting, but stands in the exhibition for the large maestas or virgins enthroned that Duccio produced, most significantly, of course, for the high altar of the cathedral in Siena, something we'll come on to shortly. But Siena, yes, Nicola, has a very particular veneration of the Virgin. I mean, in some ways, that's true of practically every city in medieval Europe. But in Siena, it was connected to the mythology and creation of the city. In the 1260s, the Sienese defeated the Florentine at a battle called Monteperti, which is about 10 miles outside the city of Siena. And the story, as it was told, was that the Virgin enveloped the Sienese army in her cloak, and this enabled them to be hidden from the Florentines, who had a far bigger military force on this occasion. And the Sienese tiny army routed the Florentines at Monteperti. Um, of course, there wasn't a cloak of the Virgin; it was a cloud. But it's amazing how this story stayed as part of the Sienese civic mythology. And therefore, the Virgin is represented in Siena's painting not just as the Queen of Heaven, but as the protectress of the city. And indeed, in one of the objects that we can't show, and that Simone Martini's Maestà painted for, again, another wall in the Palazzo Pubblico, the Virgin is shown under a baldacchino or under a canopy where the coats of arms of Siena are actually there. So she is really articulated there very clearly as Siena's queen, as well as that of heaven. But yes, the Virgin is venerated in all sorts of ways, and it's a very personal relationship as well. Generally, these artists show the Virgin and Virgin as cuddling or kissing the child, as in here, touching each other in the way that implies that the artists know what it is like to see that close connection between mother and child, between parent and child, that those of us who've had children or grandchildren or just been with small children remember exactly what it's like.
Yes, and that sort of sense of observing and trying to stay true to the real world, even though you're painting a virgin, you know, the connection between her and the child. And in some of we see also little details about nature coming through. It's sort of quite early in that journey of nature coming back into artworks after the long sort of Middle Ages. But I thought maybe should we talk about some of the innovations? Because I think the next work speaks to the innovation of independent panels, doesn't it?
Yes,
So let
that's
me just
right.
go on to that one. Let me just, there we go. So we see on the right, the back of this polyptych, don't we?
Yes. Yeah, so this was in the exhibition we brought together two triptychs, so three paneled objects by Duccio, movable objects that hadn't been together since they were in the possession of the person whose will they're mentioned in, and that is a Italian bishop who is the Bishop of Ostia. He's from Prato. He dies in Avignon, a place that will come up again and again in our narrative. And this will records three triptychs. We have two that survive, and it's the first document example we have actually in Italian art of objects of this kind that are together that were made for an individual, and where the objects also survive. So it's really, really, really rare. And this painting from Boston traveled across the Atlantic. I don't think it will ever travel again, because it is just remarkable to see them together. And you can see the back of the object on Nicola's other slide. And it's really important to think of paintings not just as flat things that hang on a wall, but as objects. That was key to the artists working in this period, and particularly in Siena, where there's a strong tradition that we'll come onto of other artists working in metal or in other forms. Art is movable, it's not static. It can be animated in different ways by the beholder or by the user. And that's why the triptych or the polyptych multi-paneled paneled objects come into existence. It's because they play a role in devotional practice, which individuals are taking a role of that. They're not just following what someone tells them, and that's really fascinating for us to look at as art historians too, to try and think about from how we manipulate and move and look at an object today, how it might have been used by somebody 700 years ago. And this object which you see on the screen open, if you close it, you have to close and open it in a particular way. And so you open one wing, you open the next, and therefore the crucifixion inside is revealed very, very carefully. So again, whether the artist talked to the commissioner about it, we just don't know. But clearly there was a strong intention in mind, which was not just that of the artist in an object like this.
It was incredibly influential then in the development of early Netherlandish painting. You know, you think of all the diptychs and triptychs painted by, you know, the wonderful Roger van der Weyden and Dirk Bouts, etc., etc. So, but the other thing I wanted to say is that I urge people to read the catalogue because it's really wonderful, and it talks very much about how, because these objects were often small and movable, they could be taken on trips. So this bishop took this triptych, no doubt, to Avignon, and then that led to the spread of the style all over Europe. So there's a whole chapter in the book about how Sienese style spreads to Bohemia, spreads to France, spreads to the southern Netherlands, and even spreads to England, as we'll see at the
As
very
we'll
end.
see.
Yes,
Shall we
yeah,
move on, Nicola? There's so much
absolutely.
we
Let's
can
do
talk
that. I
about.
know. Well, this was very strange, isn't it?
This is a wonderful object, and this was the object that Joanna Cannon was absolutely adamant that we would have in the exhibition.
Mhm.
And at the beginning, I was like, Joanna, we can't have this head. I mean, it's the strangest thing. But actually, she was so right, because it's a totally amazing thing. So this is an object, the object with the parchment you see underneath it. It really talks to how can we understand, how do we know about what an artist's intentions are? Often as art historians, we speculate as to what that might be. So this is the fragment of a crucifix, which became a fragment in during the Second World War, when Siena was bombed as the Germans retreated from the city, and this was this bombing just outside Siena was an Allied bombardment. And the crucifixion by Lando, who's one of the most important Sienese woodworkers of the 14th century, was almost completely destroyed. There are a few fragments of elbows, of fingers, and of this head. And the destruction of this was an appalling tragedy. But when the head was separated from the body, this little parchment, these two bits of parchment that you see below, came out. And this is one of the earliest testaments we have to why an artist made work. And Lando says specifically, I am making an image of Christ. You are to worship Christ, not the image that I have made.
Yeah.
So it's an extraordinary work, Nicola, because it takes us by historical chance into what an artist's ideas of making art were. It's really, really moving and very powerful, but something that the artist never intended anyone to see. It was his personal testimony, really, his testimony for the work and also for what he believed the purpose of what he made work for. And it was quite wonderful to be able to have these two objects together in the exhibition, because this exhibition was about the rise of painting, but it's also about the identity of an artist, of artists, and 14th century Siena. Those painters particularly are really interested in their names. They put their names on work in an unusual way. They identify themselves, they identify their city. And so this felt like a very appropriate comparison to be able to make in the exhibition, and also something that makes a point by its physical form. A lot of people were very struck by this head in the show. They might not have heard of Lando, they might not have ever known his work before, but this was a very powerful juxtaposition and a very powerful physical presence, even though it's a sculpture in a show that was predominantly or often about painting.
It's very nice that you were able to have some sculptures, because we know that a lot of the works from Siena were frescoes, for example, or works that are actually, immovable from the chapels
Mm,
themselves or the
mm.
churches. So it's nice that this one was able to come to the exhibition.
No, it was lovely, and we did have quite a bit of sculpture in the show. But as an exhibition in the National Gallery, which is a collection of paintings, most of the shows that the National Gallery does relate in some way or other to the story of painting.
Mm.
And that's why a sculpture in a National Gallery exhibition is often quite different in its presentation to other places. And that was also an interesting juxtaposition and contrast with how the show was presented in the Met. Exhibitions are always very different because there are ideas manifest in physical form, but they're really about the objects, not about the ideas. And the presentation of the objects is very much impacted on the place where they're being displayed. That place physically, how it connects, how you can tell a story, but also what that place might mean more generally itself. And the Met, of course, is an encyclopedic museum with collections from all over the world and of all periods, whereas the National Gallery is a museum which is very much about painting.
Mm, mm. Absolutely. Shall we move on to the next
Let's
object,
do
Caroline?
that. This exhibition was focused on several figures as painters, but also we wanted to look at the juxtaposition, as Nicola was saying, between painting and other forms. Painting is not an art form which was exclusive of itself. We wanted to make those connections, so you saw them in the Lando, and also if we go forward one more slide, Nicola, perhaps to the ivory, this was also there to make that relationship and also to make the point that sometimes because artists are connected and because they talk, you can have paintings that are sculptural. You also can have works in other media that might be more pictorial. And there's this constant dialogue we can see from visual objects between artists in this period, even if they're not documented in forms of manifest written connections. They are there as visual connections. This little ivory diptych, an object made in France, but again, the sort of object that we know that Sienese painters and artists had access to because of the trade route, the Via Francigena that we talked about in the last presentation on this exhibition in July, the pilgrimage route that connected from Canterbury to Rome, but also the strong trade connections between northern France and between Siena.
And so, do we think with something like this that the influences would have gone both ways? Because it looks quite Italianate to me, some of those
Mm,
figures. Thinking of the wonderful
mm.
the baptistry in Pisa and things,
Mm.
with the crucifixion. It seemed quite Italianate in some ways. So presumably all this imagery is moving around through these little objects and through books of hours and prayer books and illuminated manuscripts of various kinds.
Yes, indeed, and in ways that the rather linear ways in which we've written art history haven't possibly until the last 20 or 30 years ago been so, au fait with. One of the words I always try not to use, and I'll do my best not to use it tonight, is influence. And the reason I
Mm,
hate that is because that seems to suggest a linear relationship,
mm,
and often these are connections which are much more subtle.
mm,
And they happen in a number of different fashions. The way that art history used to be taught was that everyone went from the north to the south or from the south to the north, and particularly that Southern Europe was really the focus of the most innovation, and that things then trickled across the Alps. Of course, that story is much more complicated, much richer, much more interesting from this diversity. And
mm. And of course, Avignon played a big role too, and we'll see Avignon in another work in a while, won't we?
Absolutely. The fact art is never separate from political or geopolitical connections and relationships. And one of the reasons why the art of Siena is so rich at this time is because Siena was so rich. And
Mm,
the connection with Avignon specifically because the papacy moves from Rome to Avignon, something which is called the Babylonian captivity, or because the papacy is more more connected with the French monarchs at this time. But that, of course, has a huge impact not just on the city of Avignon, but on many other places in Europe, Siena being one.
mm. So should we go on to
Let's do that.
next? Yeah, like there we are. Oh, this is such a wonderful work. Would you like to say anything
Oh
about
my
this?
goodness. I think you should
Yeah.
start, Nicola.
Oh no, I mean this is so I studied early Netherlandish painting, and of course this is an absolutely seminal work, where a lot of the where our course began really was looking at works like this. But Caroline, please, you talk about it. You're You're the expert on this, not me.
I don't feel I mean, this is such a tiny object as well. This is the strange thing
Mm,
about slides. It gives no sense of dimension. So this is a book of ours. So this is a book that Jeanne d'Evreux held in her hands. She used in her worship. And it's also very, very significant from the opening that we chose for its monochrome nature. And again, you'll have seen from the number of crucifixions that we've looked at this strong connection again between painting made in Siena, ivories made in France, other objects from elsewhere. And here there is such a strong concentration on the grief of the Virgin, her swooning form, and this intense emotional engagement is something which one sees very, very much in Sienese painting.
mm,
And this, of course, the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, is a period when people are encouraged to have a much more personal relationship with God and with the Virgin. And people are encouraged increasingly, and this is one of the roles that art has, to see themselves, to imagine themselves, or to imagine the physical, the visceral impact of the suffering on Christ and on the other participants. And this is a feature of, I feel, which Pucelle demonstrates so effectively in this tiny, tiny little, very, very precious illumination.
it's beautiful, isn't it?
It really
So of
is.
course this is one of the absolute key works and such a success that you've managed to bring together so many of the different panels. Will you tell us briefly about the Maestà and why, what we've got here in the exhibition, which you can just see on the bottom, a series of, are there 8 of them, Caroline?
There
Panels, and how many?
are there's
Two,
one
three, four,
missing.
five, six, seven.
One's
Yeah,
gone.
yeah.
One was lost. So Ducci's Maestà, which you're seeing on the left and right of this slide, is a double-sided altarpiece, one of the very, very first, if not the first. And this was made for the high altar of the cathedral, that wonderful dark green, looks black, but it's actually dark green and white marble cathedral, which sits on one of Siena's hills, the great temple of church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And we know that Duccio is commissioned not actually by the Comune, by the city of Siena, to make this extraordinary object, which shows on the front, which is on the left-hand side of the screen, of the screen, the Maestà, or the Christ and Virgin in glory, in majesty, surrounded by the saints of the court of heaven and also of the angels. And you can see that this is an absolutely huge object. It's an object that we know was carried through the streets of Siena from Duccio's workshop up to the cathedral by a procession, which practically everyone in the city is said to have participated in, accompanied not just by people, but also by music, by sound, by noise, by all sorts of festivity. Um, and one of the most innovative parts of this great altarpiece is the fact that you have on the front, you have Christ and the Virgin in Majesty. On the back, you have the stories of the life of Christ. But at the bottom, you have what are called predella. And these are these box-like structures which have two purposes. One is to actually provide a structure into the rest of the panel can be put into so that it physically works as an object, but predominantly it's here as a way of telling narratives and stories. And in the exhibition that was in London this year and New York last year, we were able to reconstruct for the first time in many centuries the back predella. So those are the stories that you see on the right-hand side of my slide at the lower level. And Nicola's put an image of people looking at it pictures in the exhibition, together with one of the reconstructions of how we feel it might have been when it was made. And these are stories from Christ, on this part, on the back predella, from Christ's temptation, up until the raising of Lazarus. So the episodes of the Christological cycle which prefigure Christ going into Jerusalem, and the moments of Holy Week. And Duccio makes the Maestà over a period of 5 years. And during that, he really refines his style, his technique, and his way of storytelling. And what's remarkable about the back predella is that it's the part of this huge painting he came to last. So when he had really thought through his narrative techniques and how he wanted people to understand things in visual form. This was also the part of the altarpiece that would have been more visible, perhaps more comprehensible to people than others. You've got to imagine this was in a huge church. Most people didn't get access to it because it was root screen, but also the panels which Nicola's shown you, and we're going to scroll through a few of them now, the individual panels. It is remarkable how in such varied fashions he tells the narrative, but there are certain features that run through them. Christ is always very obvious in his blue and red, as you saw in the figure of the calling of Andrew and Peter, and here in the figure of the scene of the marriage of Cana here, where Christ is here with his mother, turning the water at this great feast into wine. What was really fascinating about bringing these objects together was the interconnections between them, and how you see the panels put together in a screen, but when you're actually in a space and you're picking things out, you make all sorts of connections. And one connection which we were able to make particularly related to this scene, the raising of Lazarus. And this normally is one of the treasures of the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth in Texas. And you see the visceral sort of sensation that people have when the door of Lazarus's coffin or tomb is opened, and the smell that there is of a body that has been has been
Yes,
dead
look
for
at
a few
him.
days.
Yeah.
You can see the man who got the yellow robe
Yes, he's got the,
holding up his hand
yeah, yeah.
to his mouth and covering it with his cloth. Um, but what's really prominent, apart from the figures of Lazarus and of Christ, is the woman wearing red who's in the bottom foreground, and that's Mary Magdalene, and she is reaching to touch Christ's feet because she wants her brother to be brought back from the dead. And in the exhibition, beside this, on the left-hand side, was a scene of Christ's transfiguration. And it was wonderful. You could see that Mary is looking directly into that scene there. So
Oh,
there
I
is the
have it. No, we
sense
haven't. Yeah,
of,
yeah.
we haven't got that, but
Yes,
there's the
yes,
sense of real links between the panels, and Duccio
yeah.
enables the viewers really to see that. And that was remarkable about the reunification that we were able to make.
It's amazing. So, just two things. So, am I right in thinking that the main panels, the up above, those are still in situ in Siena, but
Those
that
are
the sorry, yeah,
That's right. The
yeah.
predella panels went round the world,
Ah, so they were got
because
dispersed.
in the
Yeah.
18th century, this altarpiece, which actually was only on the high altar of the cathedral for a reasonably short period of time, in the 18th century, it was cut in half. And so when you go to the Museo dell'Opera dell'Uomo in Siena, you'll see on one side of the room the wonderful room in which these pictures are housed, the ones that stayed in Siena. You see the Maestà on one wall, and opposite you see the scenes of the life of Christ. But the predella panels were chopped up. It was initially, I think, because they thought they would be able, they were the most sellable part of the altarpiece, and some of them did leave. So we have pictures that are now in Texas, in Madrid, in London, in New York, as well as in Siena itself, and these are all paintings that are among the museums they belong to, are probably among the most precious objects in that
Mm,
collection.
mm.
So we were incredibly happy and delighted that our colleagues were prepared to lend them for this
Amazing.
reunification,
What
not
a
in their
feat.
museums, but in two others.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I mean, that's such a coup to have done that. But I think the other thing that I think is amazing about these panels is the sense of naturalism. I mean, you were
Mm,
talking about the body, Lazarus's body and the smell.
mm,
I mean, that you see there, and it's incredibly naturalistic, isn't he? That reaction of holding his cape up to cover
mm.
his nose. But when you look at the other ones as well, I mean, the anecdotal detail here and the one that I particularly love, I'm not sure if you can actually see, I think you can see
Mm.
some wine being poured here, can't
Yes, you can. You
and
can see
you
some
can,
red coming
yeah,
out.
and something water or something coming there. But
Mm.
the one that I particularly love is this one with the fish in the water, which is extraordinary, and how he's painted the water to be quite translucent. So he's only used probably a glaze, I would think, on that bottom part, to suggest the green, the sort of translucent water that you can see, the crystalline water that you can see the fish through it. And that's amazing. That this is really one of the sort of really early points of the introduction of naturalism, isn't it? After Giotto and the works in Padua. And look at the nets that they're being carried in. I mean, it's so carefully observed and
It
described for us, isn't it?
it is. Those details are, though others, such as the oar. I'm not sure that Duccio possibly ever was in a boat. I'm not sure you're going to be able to do very much with that. But the fishes and the nets are
Yeah.
absolutely remarkable, and it's a different type of naturalism to the naturalism of Giotto and the Florentine tradition, which is often it's more monumental. Here, there's something marvelous often in the anecdote, such as the fact here in the net you can see all the different little parts of the net are carefully described, and similarly in the scene of the marriage of Cana, we were looking at all the crockery. You could tell it's maiolica. You can see the knives. You can see the pattern on the
Mm.
tablecloth. You are really meant to believe that this is happening in an environment which has some
Yeah.
connection to your own.
And that's very different, isn't it, to the very monumental Florentine tradition that you were talking about. And I think this really influences the development of, well, I know you hate that word, but we see it come into those illuminated manuscripts that then the Netherlandish, Flemish manuscript illuminators also work in that very anecdotal style with lots of details from life. So it's
Mm,
fascinating. And yes, and look at the cloth at the end of the table with that beautiful weave, the black and white weave. No, it's
absolutely.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it is really wonderful. And the
yeah.
scale of these pictures also make them, I think, reasonably digestible. Something I've been very struck by for the last decade, and is that when people see paintings that are on a gold ground in museums, often they don't know what they're not sure how they're supposed to look. These objects look superficially very different, quite alien to some people to our world. And yet there is a stronger connection than one would ever believe because of the visceral nature of subjects such as the crucifixion, as how they're shown, and then the very anecdotal detail of a
Mm,
scene like this.
mm,
I hope that people, after seeing these exhibitions, feel that the art of the 14th century is not as far away as they might have
mm,
thought, and it has connections and can talk
mm.
to our lives today.
Shall we move on to this? I mean, we have to talk about this, Caroline, don't we? Perhaps if you could describe it for the viewers in case they haven't seen the exhibition.
So, in the one of the other objects that we were particularly keen and astonished that we were able to bring back together is an object of several panels known as the Orsini polyptych. And it's known as that because it's an object of several panels, and it was made for a member of the Orsini family. And in fact, you can see a member of the family in one of the other panels for this object. And this shows again, on one side, you see the Annunciation. On the other side, you see Christ taking his cross. You see, there we see the
Mm.
Annunciation,
Yeah, yeah,
which is again really remarkable because there is a sense of dialogue, of dynamism, and relationship between the participants. So the Archangel Gabriel, is brings the news to Mary, this ordinary girl from Nazareth, that she is to bear the Son of God. And Simone Martini shows her shock at this news by the way in which her body is so tiny in comparison to the massive throne, and also the way in which she is recoiling and shrinking back into it. You can't see her body, but you can believe how it's moving underneath that blue and that red robe. And the Rossini polyptych is really remarkable because the viewer plays an important role in it. So these are a group of objects which were together, but they could have been together in a number of different ways. And we think that they might have been, when closed, look a bit like a stone. And you can see that on the right-hand side in the video that Nicola is showing, there is a coat of arms of the Orsini, but with a polychromed surface that looks like a precious stone called porphyry. So that when the object's closed, that's what you'd see. And then you open, on one side, you see this remarkable Annunciation. And on the other side, you see Christ moving to his crucifixion from the city of Jerusalem to, as he's shown on the cross with the figure of Mary Magdalene in red, holding on to it. Then we see his deposition being taken down with the commissioner of the work, Cardinal Orsini, himself putting himself in at the bottom. And then in the last scene from Berlin, you see Christ being mourned again by Mary Magdalene, particularly, and his mother, as his body is placed in the tomb. These are panels made by an artist, Simone Martini, who is probably one of the most emotional artists in the tradition of Western painting. They're tiny, and yet they have this incredible ability to move and to shape us, the viewer, even 700 years later. The panels are all from different places. There are two of the panels you see on this image are from Antwerp. The one on the far right-hand side is from Berlin. The image we showed you a few minutes ago of Christ coming out of Jerusalem is from the Louvre. And to be able to show these together was again something which hasn't been done for many centuries.
yeah.
We have a lot of
Mhm.
questions about these pictures. How were they held together? There are no hinge marks that we've been able to discover on any of the panels. So we assume that if they were connected, it might have been by glue or it might have been by leather, but we don't actually know. And what's also remarkable about these pictures is the impact that they had subsequently on painters. We know that by the 15th century, they have moved from Avignon to Dijon, where they're at the Champnol, the great monastic house there. There are strong connections with French 15th century painting as well. So these are dynamic objects, not just for Cardinal Orsini, who held them, who used them, but for artists and people for several centuries later.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. So I work these days on Spanish art, as you know,
Mm,
and that figure of Mary Magdalene with her hands up
mm,
in lamentation, you find her in so many paintings in Spain. So
Mm,
clearly, we know that a lot of Spanish artists came to Siena
mm,
in the 14th century and went back, particularly to Catalonia. And you
mm.
see so many quotes from these works.
He was really remarkable, and I think that, one and his works are very rare. Who knows what people may find. There are some lost works. Perhaps we will find them. We will find them one day. Interestingly, one of the areas where discoveries are made often have been in the last 20 years is in the field of 13th and 14th century Italian paintings, because pictures might disappear. They get reclassified as Byzantine icons. People don't really know what they're looking at.
Mhm.
So maybe we will find another Simone.
So here's another Simone that you had.
This is possibly my favorite object in the entire exhibition. It's a
Mhm.
painting which shows you, I think, the depth of the investigations and interpretations that these painters, Duccio, Ambrogio and Pietro Lorenzetti, and Simone Martini, are able to make in Siena in a space of only a few years. We started the exhibition rather with Duccio's Madonna and Child, a painting of the very late 13th century, one of the treasures of the Met. And those of you who were with us for the last session will remember we talked a lot about that, about how it looks like an icon, but it's so remarkably radical in the connection between mother and child. This painting, made about 60 years later, is very radical in a different way. And several ways I'd suggest. One is the very human connection that we've talked about before tonight, Nicola. Um,
Mhm.
but this is a connection which is not a straightforward one. It's again subtle, and where you, the viewer, have to work really hard too. And or at least that's my take on it. So this is an episode that's very rarely depicted by artists at this moment, of Christ who had gone to the temple in Jerusalem. He'd gone to Jerusalem with the people he thought were his parents, his mother, and his stepfather Joseph, and they lost him. And imagine the horror of losing your teenage son in a city he didn't know and with lots of people. And the biblical record is very scant, but as a mother, I can imagine how terrified they were. Um, and but as the story is narrated, again, Christ says, when asked where he was, he said, I was in my father's house. He was in the temple. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. So, one reading of this painting might be that Joseph, who's holding out his hand saying, Son, look at your mother, is remonstrating with the teenage Christ and saying, You've really done a terrible thing here. Look how upset your mother is. She seems to be less upset than you might imagine, but she's also putting her hand out in some sort of gesture, which could be of relief, it could be of recognition, but it could also be of, my goodness, what that was a terrible thing to do. You'll see that Joseph has his hand round the teenage boy and God's shoulder, and the boy has his arms crossed. A lot of people have interpreted that as a sense of as a sense of truculence, of anger. It is a gesture that you often see teenagers do today, but it could also be. It's been suggested a gesture of resignation. And I think what's so interesting about Simone is that he doesn't say one or the other. He leaves you to make this up for yourself, to
Mhm.
make up the possibility. And he also enables you to make this your own, because the picture is not like some of the others we've looked at, filled with lots of anecdotal detail. Um, they are standing on ground, and there is a background behind them which is completely plain. It's just gold. So it can be wherever you want this to be.
The fabrics are just amazing. I mean, he's such a great colorist, and just look at that, the sort of the purpley pink of Joseph's cape.
The painting
Yeah.
is also in remarkable condition.
Mm.
And at the bottom, you will also be able to see that it has been signed
Kind.
by
Yes.
Simone Martini and dated
Yes.
1342.
Yes.
These painters are very, very keen on putting their name on paintings. And partly that's because many of these objects are made not to be in the city of Siena. But I think it's also to go back to that question we talked about Lando Di Pietro's Head of Christ at the beginning of our conversation this evening, that the figure of the artist is being identified, but they're being identified as somebody who is creating something that is that has a divine inspiration, but it's still being identified. This is painted by the artist. You are not looking directly at something that is divine.
I just love this painting. And Roger Lorenzetti was just such a brilliant, brilliant artist. I did a post on Instagram about the frescoes of good and bad government.
Mm.
This is, of course, by him as well.
We looked very briefly at Pietro Lorenzetti earlier. Pietro is very monumental, very, very interested, most obviously, in the language of sculpture. Ambrogio is a great intellectual, and he expresses that in pictorial form. He's a huge innovator. This painting is perhaps the earliest example of perspective that we know in it that survived in Western painting, and he plays with it and with us by having the column that's at the center of the composition that divides the figure of Gabriel and Mary, of being incised partly in gold. And when you look at it in real, as opposed to on a screen, it moves and it changes with your eyes. So the painting really seems like it's becoming something that's live, that's animated not just by your gaze, but also by that of light. This painting is now back in the Pinacoteca Nazionale in Siena, and I went to visit it there about 6 weeks ago. And it was as remarkable seeing it in that home as it had been in the exhibition in London and New York. He's truly a remarkable painter. And this was made for the tax office officials in Siena. Lucky them
Right.
is all I can
Yeah.
say.
So we've talked a little bit about sculpture. So maybe should we go on to some of the other media?
Yes, Sienese artists were very, very famed for their work in enamels. And in fact, it's one of we know that it's also an art form from Siena that travels throughout Europe. People come to Siena on their way to or from Rome, and they commission objects which end up in Spain, they end up all over France, they end up, through the Italian peninsula. And what's remarkable about working in enamel is that the colors are fixed. So sometimes we lose in paintings the remarkable colors and dazzling variety between them that an artist had intended. And we see them very, very much in these objects. And in something like the Orsini polyptych that we were looking at, I think Simone is really trying to capture this type of effect, this type of clarity from looking at objects such as these. And we can only imagine the relationships that may have existed between painters and goldsmiths. We know that goldsmiths are very highly valued. Their type of art is also one that's connected to the art of drawing, as of course is painting. And in later centuries, there's strong connection between them, as indeed there is in the 14th century. But this is
This
a
becomes,
tiny object. This is,
yeah, really
4
tiny.
centimeters by 4 centimeters in diameter.
Yes.
And it was a
Amazing you've got
challenge.
such a good photograph. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a challenge to display them as
Yeah.
beautifully.
Yeah. And of course, again, Paris took up the baton, didn't they? And
Mm,
the Duke of Berry and his
mm,
entourage commissioned the most wonderful
mm.
objects in enamel. And I suppose, again, perhaps via Avignon, they knew about these kind of objects. Um,
Yes, I think that's right. They do them in quite different ways, but these objects are really exported. This is the marvelous chalice of Peter of Sassoferrato. They're also very fragile, so borrowing them is difficult. But it is again, you see here, I think, the intensity of the color
Mm.
and of this wonderful object, which again shows scenes from Christ's Passion, such as his crucifixion at the bottom. So a priest would be raising this to their mouth at the moment of the Mass, and they would have the scenes that they were envisaging, that they were recreating before them and their eyes in a remarkable object like this.
These objects also remind us of the richness in Siena as a center of trade and commerce. You can imagine all this gold must have been coming from Africa. As
Yes.
the ivory too, we need to also think about how these trade routes, the availability of these materials, made it possible for people to make the objects and then export them to other places.
Yes, I mean, the gold comes from sub-Saharan Africa, and it's an area that a number of scholars have worked on in recent years, including Imogen Tedbury, who was one of the co-curators of the exhibition and this is an area of research that she's been working on recently. We were also very keen in the exhibition to look at how we could make those trade routes manifest through connections and objects. And one way in which we were able to do this was through textiles, thanks to the remarkable generosity of the scholar Lisa Monas, who advised us and supported us in so many ways, and who also whose writing is included in the
Oh,
publication with the exhibition. But these we I mean textiles were so valuable at the time, and I mean these objects that you're seeing here are in incredible condition, coming from China and from Iran. You see again this great clarity of color and of patterns that are so specific, and which the painters then, we know that they are looking at some of these direct forms,
yeah.
and it's remarkable as we, looking at objects made 700 years ago, are making connections and bringing them into our lives. Similarly, these painters are looking at objects made a similar sort of time, but thousands of miles away, and again revivifying them in their own fashion.
Mm. Yes, anybody that manages to get hold of the catalogue, I really recommend Lisa Monis's article. It's just wonderful about these textiles and about how the different painters use them in the paintings. And she really makes you look in great detail at the paintings and think about what bits of textile they were looking at. So you could walk from a painting to a textile and back again, and carpets as well,
Mm.
which we often see in these paintings.
We do, we do.
Mhm.
And again, these carpets, these textiles were extraordinarily valuable at the time, and they're often used. The textiles in the West in burial of religious figures or important secular ones, or indeed for the secular figures in their robes of coronation or of throning. But this is a very beautiful rug. It's so rare to find rugs that are in good condition from this period, and also which then have a connection with paintings. And this we the partnership with the Met and with the National Gallery enabled each museum to show objects which otherwise would have been impossible to borrow, because you will work together in partnership in a way that you might not be able to lend to other exhibitions. So it enables a great richness of things to come together.
And do we think this one came from Central Asia? Is that the, I don't
We
think there
think
was
we
a,
we think
yeah,
this is Anatolian, probably. I mean,
Anatolian,
that is
right?
one of the great
Yeah.
centers of the carpet
Hmm.
trade,
Hmm.
for several centuries after this. And often these types of prayer rugs are what then end up in Western painting. And I think it's not just, they've not just taken the form. There is a sense also of the sacred nature of these objects, even transposed into a different religious setting.
Absolutely. You see them in Netherlandish art. In Jan van Eyck's paintings, for example, the Virgin is and the saints are standing on these carpets, aren't they? But I just wanted really to end on this because it was so nice to bring this into the exhibition, something which normally lives in the National Gallery in London and which, of course, belonged to the British monarchy at an early date.
Well, absolutely. This is the Great Wilton diptych, one of the earliest paintings in the National Gallery's collection, and one of the reasonably few English pictures. And this was again gives you a great sense of locality and place because this was, we know, made for King Richard. It was in Westminster Abbey, so it was a very, very short distance physically away from the National Gallery where it now resides. And this was made by an artist who we're now pretty confident was French, but an artist who knew the techniques of Sienese painting, the techniques of gilding, and also the techniques of painting flesh, for instance, with the green, the terra verde underneath the flesh layer, which is a technique which Italian painters really have, and which you'd only know if you'd seen someone work in that way and you didn't just know what a painting looked like on the surface, but what it looked like underneath. And also thinking of form, we looked at the Orsini polyptych, which was an object made for a very particular person, made in an unusual way. This is a time when the forms of painting are really they're innovatory forms. People, subsequently paintings are often made as diptychs, two-paneled objects or three-paneled objects, a triptych, but at this point it's really the beginning of it. And the form of this is possibly also something which the artist who made it may have known from Sienese works.
Portable, and the other thing that that you see coming back to the fabrics is look at those fabrics that he's painted there. Clearly things a bit like some of the objects we were just looking at, those amazing textiles. Well, Caroline, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank
So
you.
goodbye, everybody.